In this video, we'll explore the essential camera settings you need to understand to have full control over what you capture. Relying on automatic settings is a rookie mistake. Mastering these settings will help you achieve the desired look and feel for your videos, ensuring pro quality results. Let's dive into the key camera settings and their functions. Simply put, your frame rate is the total number of still images that your camera captures per second. When you watch 25 images from the first frame to the last frame over a single second, it creates the illusion of motion in film or video. Choosing your frame rate means deciding how many individual frames your camera will capture each second. The standard frame rates you'll encounter will largely depend where you are in the world. The most common standards are NTSC for the US and PAL for Europe. For simplicity, we'll focus on PAL since I'm based in the UK, but if you're in an NTSC region, be sure to adjust your camera settings accordingly. So what's the difference between all these frame rates and when should you use each? 25 frames per second is my go-to frame rate as it's the closest option I have to the industry standard of 24 frames per second, which is used in Hollywood feature films, which is why it feels cinematic to our eyes. Anything lower like 12 frames per second risks looking like stop motion, too choppy and blurry. On the flip side, higher than 24 frames per second, like 30 frames per second, can make your video look too smooth, resembling real life rather than cinema. You'll often see 30 frames per second used in soap operas, news broadcasts, or default camera settings on your phone. The only time I typically shoot higher than 25 frames per second is for slow motion. If I want slow motion, then I usually shoot at 50 frames per second. This means if I slow down the footage to half the speed on a 25 frames per second timeline, it will take all 50 frames and distribute them evenly. This means that the first 25 frames will be in the first second, and then the next 25 frames will be in the following second. Because I shot at exactly double my intended timeline frames per second of 25 frames, the frames are evenly distributed without any missing frames. This is why when you try to slow down footage that is shot at 25 or 30 frames per second, you can find your footage gets choppy. This is because you are essentially dividing your frames per second in half, if you want 50% speed that is, meaning each second only has around 15 or less frames per second. This is why it's important to shoot at higher frames per second if you intend to slow the footage down. If you do not intend to slow it down, I recommend 24 or 25 frames per second. Now, a little tip for you, just in case you did accidentally shoot something at a low frames per second and you want to slow the footage down, in Resolve you can go to retiming scaling, then choose optical flow. It's not perfect and still better done in camera, but if you're in a tight spot, this will definitely save you. Next up is shutter speed. This setting controls how fast your camera's shutter, which is in front of the sensor, opens and closes. A higher shutter speed means there's less time for light to enter the camera sensor, resulting in a darker image. It also affects motion blur. For example, shooting at 1/30th of a second will give you more motion blur compared to shooting at 1/1000th of a second, which results in sharp, crisp frames. A common rule of thumb is to set your shutter speed to twice your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 or 25 frames per second, aim for a shutter speed of 1/50th. This replicates the natural motion blur our eyes perceive in real life. So if you hold your hand out in front of your face and wave it back and forth, you'll actually see the motion blur that I'm talking about. There are instances when I might break this rule, like if I want to see every crisp detail of a slow motion shot, or if I'm filming a green screen, it's always best to shoot at a higher shutter speed just to make sure that the keying is easier. Or if I want there to be excessive motion blur for artistic purposes, I sometimes will shoot at 1/8 shutter speed. Generally though, I try to keep my shutter speed at twice my frame rate to maintain a cinematic look. It's common for people to get confused between frames per second and shutter speed, but the best way I can explain it is like this. Frames per second is how many frames there are per second. Simple. Shutter speed is how quick the shutter opens and closes when capturing each one of those frames. Now let's move on to aperture. This setting controls how open or closed your lens iris is, just like how the iris of our eye works. A lower aperture number like 1.8 opens the iris and allows more light in, creating a brighter image, while a higher number like f-stop 22 closes the iris and restricts light, making the image darker. Aperture also affects depth of field, which is the range of focus in your shot. A low aperture creates shallow depth of field, blurring the background and drawing attention to your subject, and conversely, a higher aperture increases the depth of field, keeping more of the scene in focus. When I'm shooting interviews or B-roll, I prefer lower apertures to emphasize my subject. But if I need both the subject and the background to be visible and detailed, I'll raise the aperture higher. At this point, it's important to remember that shutter speed affects motion blur and aperture affects how much of the scene is in focus, but they both affect how bright or dark the image is, which leads us on to the final setting that impacts exposure, which is ISO. Unlike shutter speed and aperture, increasing your ISO brightens your image by boosting the brightness in the camera artificially. Think of it like turning up the volume of a microphone so a whisper can be heard clearly. Usually when we turn up the volume of a microphone too high, we'll get distortion. That's very similar to how ISO works. The higher you push the ISO, the more the image breaks down and you will see noise in the image, making your image look grainy, Each camera has a native ISO that offers optimal image quality, so try to stick to that setting when you can. Fortunately, Sony has recently introduced dual native ISO, which means there are two ISOs that are optimal to maintain image quality and dynamic range. They are 640 ISO and 12,800 ISO. This means if I find myself needing to increase my ISO past 2,500 to expose something correctly, I will consider just switching straight to 12,800 ISO, as I know that ISO will produce a cleaner and less noisy image. Then I would increase my aperture or shutter speed to bring the exposure back down where it should be. There is one other way to maintain correct exposure without having to touch the shutter speed, aperture or ISO, which I'll cover in the exposure video. Let's discuss white balance. This is something that beginners often forget about. White balance is crucial for achieving accurate color representation in your footage. It helps eliminate color casts caused by different light sources and ensures that the colors are true to life. Light sources have color temperatures measured in Kelvin ranging from 1,000, which is warm like candlelight, to 10,000, which is cool like the clear blue sky. Average daylight is somewhere in the middle, usually 5,600 Kelvin. When you change the white balance setting in a camera, you're effectively telling the camera what color temperature the light is in the scene, so it can accurately reproduce all the other colors. Have you ever noticed that when you take a picture of a room in your house in the evening when the inside lights are on, the walls look orange or yellow? This is because the warm light bulbs are casting the hue onto everything in that room. This color temperature is common for indoor lights and is known as tungsten, which is around 3,200 Kelvin. This means if I still wanted the colors of the room to be accurately represented despite the warm hue of 3,200 Kelvin, I would need to switch my white balance setting to tungsten, which is the preset which matches 3,200 Kelvin. In mixed lighting situations, where there is some natural sunlight and tungsten light, you would typically adjust the white balance to fall somewhere in between the two. Most cameras have an automatic white balance setting, but they can struggle in mixed lighting situations and can also shift midway through a shot and result in a shot becoming unusable. If I'm filming a live event and quickly moving between outside and inside, I will use auto white balance just to save time. However, if I'm shooting a long continuous shot like an interview or like this, or even a wedding speeches or ceremony, I'll make sure that the white balance is set manually and fixed for the entire shot. I tend to use the in-camera white balance presets instead of setting the exact white balance, as they can get me close enough and I know how to fix it when color grading. If you are less confident in color correcting and grading, I suggest trying to be as accurate as you can with white balance in camera. Picture profiles are customizable presets in your camera that determine how your images are processed and displayed. They affect various parameters including contrast, saturation, sharpness, and dynamic range. Understanding and utilizing picture profiles can significantly enhance your videos, allowing you to have either great flexibility when color grading or to achieve a specific look or feel that aligns with your creative vision. This is often the default setting, providing a balanced look suitable for most shooting situations. It typically offers good contrast, sharpness, and saturation, making it ideal for general use where you don't want to spend much time color grading. I tend to only use a standard picture profile for that exact reason. The reason I usually steer clear of it otherwise though is that it adds a bit too much sharpness and saturation to my images for my liking, which I like to add myself. A standard picture profile will also not have as much dynamic range as a log profile, meaning that there will not be as much color and light information captured, which is preferred when color grading and achieving the highest quality image possible. Which leads us on to the second picture profile, which is a log picture profile. As touched on, these profiles reduce contrast and saturation, capturing a wider dynamic range. Images that are shot in log picture profiles may appear washed out, but that's intentional, as it retains more detail in both highlights and the shadows. My go-to picture profile is S-Log3, as some of you may already know, but I often will use either Gamma Assist in camera, or I'll upload my S-Log3 LUT onto my camera or monitor, so I can clearly see how the S-Log3 footage will look. This is because otherwise I will not have the best gauge for exposure or color accuracy if I can only see the washed out footage that S-Log3 creates. I don't often use these at all, however I do know filmmakers that swear by Cine picture profiles and actually prefer them to log picture profiles for the sake of speeding up their workflow. If you do want to go down the route of using a Cine profile rather than a log profile, you can definitely make it work. Be careful though, as there is less room for error when exposing your images. If you under or overexpose, there's just less information captured to bring back detail from either blown out highlights or crushed shadows. This profile boosts saturation and contrast. I would try to avoid these altogether, as you basically rely on the camera to color grade on your behalf, which very rarely leads to good looking footage in comparison to the other picture profiles. When you're choosing a picture profile to use, you just need to consider your workflow and your desired end result. If you plan to edit extensively and want higher dynamic range, therefore more room for error when exposing and more information when you're color grading, perhaps a log profile is for you. On the other hand, if you need quick results, you might just use a standard picture profile. When you've had enough experience and you're confident you can expose perfectly pretty much most of the time, then perhaps you could choose a Cine picture profile, which is a nice balance of the two. Okay, so I appreciate that there is a lot of information to take in all at once, so I'm going to leave you with this valuable hack, which will hopefully mean that all of this will be a lot more straightforward. Most cameras will come with customizable preset modes. This means that after you've decided how you're going to shoot most of the time, you can quickly switch between your most commonly used settings. It takes a bit of time to set up, but it's well worth doing. For example, I know that I either shoot at 25 frames per second or I shoot at 50 frames per second, and that's it. I usually want my ISO to be set at the lowest native ISO to retain the most quality, and I want the camera to be as bright as it can be with that ISO, which means the aperture will be as low as possible and my shutter speed will be double my frame rate. I also want to make sure that I'm shooting in the same picture profile, otherwise I will have footage that does not match each other, and that would be a nightmare for color grading. For this reason, I match all of my settings and create a save preset for a 25 frames per second version and a 50 frames per second version. And now switching between normal speed and slow motion is super fast and easy, and there won't be any discrepancies. That's it for this video. Be sure to master these settings and you will genuinely be ahead of 90% of content creators just by nailing the basics. Have fun with it, and if you have any questions, you can ask me.